there's this belief that we don't already have sovereign currency, which is absurd. Can you talk about why the US dollar is not the Federal Reserve's private corporation, blah, blah, blah? Can you please just spend a few moments and debunk that so we can move on to bigger and better things?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first, anyone who will look at the founding of the Fed, read the Federal Reserve Act that founds the Fed, they will understand there's no question about this whatsoever. The Fed is a creature of Congress. It is an agency of the government. Congress can dictate to the Fed what the Fed should do. And Congress occasionally does take control over the Fed. It did it in both of our world wars, and it's done it as recently as just a couple decades ago, when it told the Fed, you will buy government bonds. I mean, the Congress can dictate anything they want to the Fed. It is part of our government. What the Fed really does is it acts as the Treasury's bank under the control of the Congress. In the old days, when the Treasury wanted to spend, they actually did issue Treasury currency. They no longer do that. They haven't done it for a long time. All the payments from the Treasury are made by the central bank, the Fed. All payments to the Treasury, including the tax payments we were talking about, are made through the Fed. The Fed is the Treasury's banks. And sometimes the Congress tells the Fed, you will be subjugated directly under the Treasury. And in some countries, that is, by law, always the Treasury dominates over the central bank. We pretend, I think because it's sort of convenient for the Fed, as if the Fed were independent. It's independent in only a very narrow sense of the term, which is that we have decided to allow the Fed to set the overnight interest rate target. We have given it some guidelines, but they're very broad. It says the Fed needs to pursue high employment and relatively stable prices. Okay, so that is a dictate that came from Congress, and that gives the Fed its marching orders. The Treasury could have been much more specific than that, and the Treasury could say, we really don't like the way you're setting the interest rate. And the Congress could take that over and say, we want you to set the overnight interest rate at 25 basis points and leave it there forever. Personally, that's the policy I prefer. So far, Congress doesn't see it my way, and maybe they never will, but they could, okay? So what we have done is we've allowed the Fed to set its overnight interest rate target. Okay. Does it make a big difference? Normally it doesn't. When Paul Volcker raised the overnight interest rate above 20%, that made a difference, okay? And I think we sort of learned a lesson from that. The Fed has not done anything that crazy, insane since then, and I don't think they ever will again. But that's the extent of its independence. There is no possibility that the Fed is going to bounce Treasury checks. It's not going to happen. The Congress puts forth a budget, the president signs it, that authorizes the spending. The Treasury will dictate to the Fed the payments that will be made according to the budgetary authority, and it's done. There's no chance that the Fed is going to say, nope, sorry, we're not going to make those payments for you. It's never happened and never will happen. So there is no independence with regard to the Fed deciding not to allow the Treasury to spend. It will not happen.